Welcome to the Appalachian Historical Review. This is the audio home for AppalachianGenealogy.com. Each week, we dig into the records, migration paths, and the real stories of the people who settled the Appalachian Range. Today's episode is sponsored by Appalachian Folkways by John B. Redder. This scholarly work provides the geographic framework needed to correlate physical terrain with cultural isolation and settlement patterns along regional waterways. The relationship between terrain and settlement is one of the most consistent patterns in Appalachian history. Redder's work gives researchers the vocabulary and the analytical structure to understand how mountains, hollows, and watercourses shaped the daily choices of early settlers. That same framework becomes essential when we attempt to locate a missing ancestor whose paper trail thins or disappears. The land itself becomes a guide, and the water level principle becomes a predictive tool for reconstructing movement across the region. As Amazon associates, we earn a commission if you use the link in the show notes to shop. Now for today's episode, the Geology of Genealogy, How Terrain Dictated Settlement. The settlement history of the Appalachian region cannot be separated from its physical geography. The mountains, ridges, coves, and creek branches created a landscape that directed human movement with remarkable consistency. Early settlers did not choose home sites at random. They followed a principle that modern researchers often call the water level principle. This principle reflects the tendency of families to settle along the lowest available elevations within a given drainage system. These areas offered the most reliable water access, the most workable soil, and the most predictable seasonal patterns. When we examine land grants, tax lists, and early surveys, we see that settlement clusters formed along these water-level corridors with striking regularity. The water-level principle is visible in the earliest land grants issued in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Surveyors recorded meets and bounds that followed creek branches, springs, and river bottoms. These descriptions were not incidental. They reflected the practical reality that the narrow floodplains and lower slopes provided the only arable land in many mountain counties. Soil quality varied sharply with elevation. The thin, rocky soils of the upper slopes could not support sustained agriculture, while the deeper alluvial soils along the creeks allowed for small-scale subsistence farming. Families who relied on corn, hogs, and small garden plots needed dependable water and workable ground. As a result, settlement patterns aligned with the natural flow of water through the terrain. Topographical maps confirmed this pattern. When we overlay early land grants on modern elevation data, the correlation becomes clear. The majority of early homesteads sit within narrow elevation bands that follow the creek systems. These bands form linear cultural corridors that extend from the headwaters down to the larger rivers. Each corridor developed its own social and linguistic identity. The mountains acted as barriers that limited movement between adjacent hollows. As a result, cultural pockets formed that preserved distinct dialects, customs, and kinship networks. These pockets persisted well into the 20th century and remain visible in oral histories and local traditions. For genealogists, the water level principle provides a practical method for predicting where a missing ancestor may have moved. When a family disappears from a county tax list or fails to appear in a census enumeration, the terrain offers clues. Families rarely crossed major ridges unless economic or social pressures forced them to do so. Instead, they tended to move along the same drainage system, either upstream toward available land or downstream toward larger communities. By examining the topography and identifying the next viable water-level corridor, researchers can narrow the search to a small number of likely locations. Primary sources support this approach. Land entry books, grant surveys, and county deed records reveal patterns of movement that follow the creek systems. Tax lists show clusters of surnames that migrate together along these corridors. Church minutes and cemetery records often reflect the same pattern. When a congregation relocated or expanded, it typically did so along the water level routes that connected related families. Even probate records can reflect this geography. Executors and witnesses often lived within the same drainage system, reinforcing the idea that kinship networks were shaped by the terrain. The cultural implications of this geography are significant. The isolation created by the mountains allowed communities to retain older linguistic forms and cultural practices. Distinctive speech patterns developed in hollows separated by only a few miles. Traditional crafts, foodways, and religious customs persisted because the terrain limited outside influence. These cultural pockets are not simply historical curiosities, they are evidence of how the land shaped identity and community structure. For genealogists, understanding these pockets helps explain why certain surnames cluster in specific hollows and why intermarriage patterns remained consistent across generations. The water level principle also helps explain the persistence of certain settlement names and landmarks. Many hollows bear the names of the earliest families who settled there. These names appear in land grants, tax lists, and oral histories. When a family moved, they often followed the same water level logic, establishing new branches of the family along similar terrain. This pattern creates a traceable chain of settlement that can guide researchers through periods where documentation is sparse. Topographical maps are essential tools for applying this principle. By studying contour lines, drainage patterns, and elevation changes, researchers can identify the most likely settlement zones. When combined with land grants and early surveys, these maps allow for a reconstruction of the historical landscape. This reconstruction can reveal abandoned homesteads, forgotten cemeteries, and lost community sites. It can also clarify the relationships between families who lived within the same drainage system. The broader impact on Appalachian research is substantial. The water level principle provides a framework for understanding migration, community formation, and cultural persistence. It offers a method for interpreting incomplete records and for predicting movement across the region. It also highlights the importance of integrating geography with documentary research. The land itself becomes a primary source, offering insights that complement traditional records. For researchers working with fragmented genealogical evidence, this approach can be transformative. It allows for targeted searches that reflect the lived reality of early settlers. It acknowledges the constraints imposed by the terrain and uses those constraints to guide the research process. By combining topographical analysis with land grants, tax lists, and oral histories, genealogists can reconstruct the movements of families who left few written records. This method respects the historical context of Appalachian settlement and provides a reliable tool for navigating the complexities of the region's genealogy. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Appalachian Historical Review. Today's stories were narrated by Glenn using the work of Misty Hamilton Smith for Appalachian Genealogy. Please visit us at appalachiangenealogy.com for more records and history from across the region. Join us next week for our next episode.